Welcome back. This time, moving away from the physiology a little bit, not talking about lungs or the heart or muscles or how any of those things adapt, but moving on to talking about psychology, because obviously, as a strength and conditioning coach, some of what you would have to do would be to motivate athletes, to help them control their anxiety, for example, to help them psych up for an all-out attempt in power clean or something like that, right? So there's a lot of psychological aspects to the job, motivating them, improving adherence, helping them see the utility of what it is that we're doing in the weight room, those kinds of things, right? So all of that touches on some of the psychological domains. So chapter 8 is, I think, overly long, but it does talk a lot about how a strength and conditioning coach might incorporate different psychological concepts into their coaching strategies. So as always, we're going to start with defining terms. And so you can see there the role of sports psychology is to help athletes achieve more consistent levels of performance at or near their physical potential by carefully managing their physical resources through appropriate psychological strategies and techniques. So one of the key concepts here with a lot of the psychology stuff in this chapter is that idea of managing those resources. That if we are really tense, if we are overly aroused, you'll see that terminology later, if we're anxious, those kinds of things, which is part of arousal, but if we're those kinds of things, like that's burning mental energy and that's to some extent burning physical energy, right? Because then you're going to end up with muscles that are tense, muscles that are short, and so that actually uses ATP to have that higher level of muscle tone, right? And so that ATP you're using, that energy you're using, both in the muscles and in the brain, is energy that could be directed toward achieving peak performance. And so the more efficient we can be with our attention and with our physical and psychological efforts, hopefully then that'll help enhance our performance or enhance the athlete's performance. So an athlete is someone who engages in social comparison. So they compare their abilities at something like rowing to that of someone else's, right? Or that their abilities in tennis, their ability to make a backhand shot to that of a teammate, to that of a competitor, those kinds of things. Psychologically well-prepared athlete is characterized by efficiency of thought and behavior. As mentioned, we want to maximize our attention on the things that matter and minimize our attention on the things that don't. And so what I was describing there is that concept of task-relevant focus. We're not focused on things that aren't a part of, hitting. If we're thinking about something like involved in swimming and diving, they're not focused on the audience. They're not focused on their parents or what their coach is going to think as they're about to start the dive. All they're focused on is the steps involved in that dive and then performance of that actual activity. So that's task-relevant focus. Worrying about the things that matter and the factors that affect performance, not, and I say worrying, focusing on the tasks that are the parts of the task that matter and not focusing on things that don't matter, that are task irrelevant. So one of the things that sports psychologists talk about a lot is this concept of being in the zone, right? And probably in your own athletic careers at some point, you've had a really good performance. And if you think back to that really good performance, probably the best that you could have done, think about your mental state in that. And so there are typical characteristics that athletes describe when they achieve peak performance. And they include things like time just seems to slow down for them, that it didn't even feel like they were trying, they didn't see anything outside of the immediate task. I know for me, when talking about this concept, one of the things that always comes to mind, and this is a lifetime ago, but my senior year in powerlifting at collegiate nationals at the national championships powerlifting meet. And the way the powerlifting meets are set up, they're oftentimes either in big gyms or in big ballrooms. This one was in a big ballroom in St. Louis. And there's two platforms going at once. And so you've got, the whole ballroom is full of chairs facing you. And so like my parents are out there, my grandparents are out there. They've driven up to St. Louis from Texas and my teammates are out there and all of that. And I didn't know any of that. Intuitively I knew that, right? But I didn't hear anything. The only thing I heard and saw was the head judge and his instructions. That was it. I was so focused on that guy, and he was the only thing that mattered, was him telling me to start the lift and him telling me to stop the lift. And that was it. And it was that way for every single attempt for all 9 attempts. And I don't think I'd experienced anything like that before. And then that was kind of the end of my competitive career. So I didn't really experience anything like that since, because I don't do athletic endeavors like that anymore. But you can see typical being in the zone or that ideal performance state is characterized by an absence of fear. There's no fear of failure. It doesn't even cross your mind. You're just out there performing. Again, everything is going to feel easy. So there's no analysis of performance. You just step out there and do it. Narrow focus of attention, which is what I was describing to you, like that I had no awareness of the audience or what they were saying. And so as an example, like my parents afterwards were like, "Did you hear us say whatever?" And I was like, "Nope, not a word," right? Didn't hear my teammates, didn't hear anything, again, other than what it was that the head judge was saying. And so, that's that narrowness of focus. If you're thinking about somebody like a baseball or softball batter, they're probably just focused on the pitcher. They don't hear anything in the audience. They don't hear, what the third base coach is saying, any of that stuff. All they're focused on is the pitcher. Again, that sense of effortlessness, everything just feels easy. And it almost doesn't feel like you're in control of it. Like stuff just happens, it's just automatic. And then a sense of personal control, which kind of goes into the effortlessness. Distortion of space and time. So you'll hear athletes talk about, like I hear this in football post-game interviews sometimes, they'll talk about how it just seemed like the game slowed down. They knew where if we're talking about a quarterback, they knew where the defensive backs were going, they knew where their receivers were going to be, they knew when they were going to be there, so everything just felt slower. And you'll hear baseball batters talk about the same thing. The pitcher, his motion slowed down, the ball slowed down, they could just see everything, right? And so that's that distortion of space and time. Everything just seems to kind of bend to your will or bend to your performance in a sort of way. So some other terminology stuff. So emotions, temporary feeling states that occur in response to events and that have both physiological and psychological components. So if we think about emotions like anger, right? So if you're really upset, you're really angry at somebody, not only is there that psychological aspect of it, but it produces a physiological response. Your muscles get tense, maybe you're clenching your fist, you're clenching your jaw, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, those kinds of things, right? So obviously emotions have not only a psychological impact, but also a physiological impact. So in that sense, or in that case, we are activating our sympathetic branch of our autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight branch, and so that's where that increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, pupil dilation, that's where all that stuff comes from. And so obviously then our emotions can affect our mental and physical energy. So sometimes, some of that anger can be useful. It gives you more energy, right? So you'll see like athletes, particularly those involved in like high contact or combat type sports, may psych themselves up and try to get really angry before a game or before an event, right? You see that sometimes. From a lifting standpoint, you see that with like with strongmen or in powerlifting. Sometimes you'll see guys who want somebody to hit them beforehand, or they will sniff smelling salts, right? So those are ammonia caplets, right? So you get this combination of the two. And so that anger, that pain feeling, because that's, you get both, right? That can then increase their level of arousal and then have a physical effect on them, all right? And so again, it can have a positive or negative effect on performance. You can get, as we'll talk about, too amped, and then that can actually hamper your performance. So arousal is an important concept, and so it's a blend of physiological and psychological activation. It's the intensity of motivation at any given moment. So your level of arousal is how aware are you of what's going on, right? How mentally in tune are you to everything? And then physically, how ready are you? Have you warmed up? Are your muscles loose? Are they tense? Those kinds of things. Anxiety, as mentioned, is a subcategory of arousal. So we obviously associate anxiety negatively. If somebody says that they're anxious, they usually don't mean that in a positive way. You could be like, oh, I'm anxious to go to Disneyland or whatever, right? That's a correct usage of the term. But oftentimes, if somebody's talking about being anxious about something, they mean it in a negative way. So it's typically a negatively perceived emotional state. So in that context, then, it's characterized by nervousness, worry, apprehension, fear, etc. And then with physiological activation, so somatic anxiety, so that's where anything somatic deals with the body. So somatic anxiety is where you get that racing heart, sweaty palms, again, muscle tension, clenching your jaw, those kinds of things. So that activation of the body to act out or act in response to that psychological stress of anxiety. And so because it requires that negative perception, so in a sporting context, it would be like you're about to go out there for, coming out of a timeout in basketball, and you have the opportunity, the ball's going to come to you, and you have the opportunity to make or miss the winning shot, right? And so if you know the ball is coming to you and you start really thinking about it, and you start thinking about like what's going to happen if I miss this shot, we're going to lose this game, my teammates are going to be disappointed with me, my parents are going to be disappointed, I don't know, we're going to go full catastrophe here, my dog's going to hate me, etc., right? And so that perception of the events that are about to unfold as being negative stress then can lead to all of those negative physical associations that we see there. Or you can interpret them negatively. Like you can interpret the racing heartbeat negatively. Like, oh man, I'm so tight, I'm so anxious, right? When in fact, viewed from a physiological standpoint, that elevated heart rate, that's revving the engine. You're ready to direct more oxygen to the working musculature. So in some ways, it's actually beneficial. But it depends on how you characterize it from a cognitive standpoint. Another important definition, so state anxiety. So you'll see this a lot in sports psychology stuff. So there's state and trait. Be aware that state something, in this case state anxiety, means how we are right now. It is your present state. As opposed to trait is something that you have most of the time. So state anxiety is I'm kind of anxious, I'm kind of nervous right now because of whatever stress that I'm about to encounter. Trait anxiety is I am just generally a nervous person. I tend to respond anxiously to a variety of stimuli. So with state anxiety, again, how we are right now, it's the experience of apprehension or uncertainty accompanied by elevated autonomic and voluntary neural outflow. Remember the autonomic nervous system. So that's that fight or flight response I talked about. So again, elevated heart rate, sweaty palms, hair standing on end, all that stuff. And then increased endocrine activity, you're releasing epinephrine, norepinephrine, which are part of that sympathetic response. Trait anxiety, again, how you are generally. So as you can see there, it's a personality variable or disposition related to the probability that one will perceive the environment as threatening. So some people respond to stressors in a negative way pretty consistently. Whether it is they have to speak in front of class, or they have something due on a tight deadline, or they're going to have the opportunity to take the winning shot, those kind of things. If there are certain people who tend to respond to those kinds of stressors very negatively consistently, right? And so that would be somebody who has trait anxiety. And so because they generally tend to respond negatively, then they tend to experience state anxiety more frequently. So where right now they're experiencing that anxiety. Psychological efficiency. So you're just focused on task-relevant cognition. So cognition is being thoughts, not thoughts of failure, and not catastrophizing. So catastrophizing is thinking all the worst things that could happen. So the thing that I was joking about earlier about, if I miss this shot, my teammates are going to be mad at me, my parents are going to be mad at me, my dog's going to be mad at me, right? So that's catastrophizing. I won't, if I fail this test, then I won't graduate from college, then I won't be able to get a job, then I'm going to have to work, at McDonald's or something like that. That's catastrophizing. And so the focus there then is on failure, right? And so because you're thinking about failure and what happens if I mess this up, you're kind of already predisposing yourself to turn that way. In terms of focusing on task-relevant cognitions, so because it's 2021, I was thinking about Giannis and his free throw shooting in the playoffs this year, and how the fans would count, because supposedly he does take a really long time with his free throw shots, but supposedly he took too long and it should have been a rule violation and all that stuff, right? So people were always counting to 10 whenever Giannis would take his free throws. And so in some games that certainly seemed to affect him. I don't know how it wouldn't. In fairness to him, I don't know how you tune out 40,000 people counting at you. But in some games he seemed to do okay. And then in the championship game, which was at home, so that helped. But in the championship game, he was really good at that, and he was able to just focus on those task relevant things of his basic routine of taking the shot. There's the deep breath, the practice shot. I mean, if you watch the Bucks, we all kind of know his routine by now. The practice dribble, right, and then he goes through those same steps all the time, so that he can just focus on the things that matter, those movements in that order, focus on the front of the rim, and then making the shot. same information in graphical form. So there's that. If you're into data visualizations, there's one of those. All right, so stress then is an imbalance between the demand, whether it's a physical demand, a psychological demand, or both, and the response capability. So the imbalance between the demand and your ability to respond under conditions in which failure to meet the demand has important consequences. So, people may be stressed about exams, right? So they may perceive an imbalance between their ability to understand the material and then their ability to respond to the questions, i.e., to get enough of them right to pass the class, right? And so then if you fail the test, potentially you fail the class, and then that costs you money. Maybe it delays your graduation, those kinds of things. So those are obviously pretty important consequences of the failure to pass that test. And so if you perceive that there's an imbalance between the difficulty of the test and your ability to understand the material and respond to those questions, then that can lead to stress because, again, there may be some negative consequences if you're not able to respond to that. So a stressor then is an environmental or cognitive event that precipitates stress, so that leads to stress. And that can be negative or positive. So in terms of, a positive stressor, maybe something like getting married or being at your wedding, right? That would potentially be a positive stressor because it's probably still going to be, when you're at that event, even though it's a happy occasion, you are going to probably be a little bit nervous about it, a little bit stressed, right? You're going to have a racing heart rate and all those other physical responses we talked about, even though it's positive, right? And you're perceiving this whole thing as being positive, but it's still kind of stressful in a way, right? And then a negative stress would be the example I gave a second ago about failing the test. So stressors then can generate arousal. So again, think of it as heightened awareness, heightened sensitivity to the environment around you. And so if you perceive that arousal as negative, then that can generate anxiety. So if you perceive that heightened awareness, that hyperperception as negative, then that can generate anxiety, can be psychologically stressful for you, I guess is a way to say that. So obviously then there's a relationship between our emotions and how we perform. So there are several different theories, and they all kind of build on each other. This book and many others kind of lay them out like, here's the early theory. Here's why that was wrong. Here's a follow-up theory that made that one a little better, but here's why it still wasn't very good. So this is kind of the layout of that. So drive theory, and I don't have a graphic of what drive theory is, but basically it's that there's a linear relationship between arousal and performance. So if you are asleep, you are not aroused at all, right? So you are physically relaxed, you are psychologically relaxed, you are unconscious, right? And so that's zero arousal, as opposed to the most amped up you've ever been, right? Where your heart is racing, your core temperature is higher, you're very excited. Maybe it's a post-game celebration after your team won the championship, whether as a fan or as a player, right? And so that's probably about as aroused as you've ever been, right? And so the idea here in drive theory is that the more we can increase arousal, the more performance is going to increase. But obviously that's not entirely true because different sports skills require different levels of arousal. So for something like powerlifting, one of the things about powerlifting, so the events in powerlifting are squat, bench press, and deadlift. Those are the contested lifts. And so the level of complexity of those lifts is pretty low. They're not hard to do, right? Almost everybody can do a back squat, bench press is pretty straightforward, and deadlift is the most straightforward of all lifts. All you gotta do is pick it up, right? So that's all pretty straightforward. And so for something like that has a low level of complexity and a low level of skill, increasing arousal does tend to enhance performance. So like I said, you'll see athletes who, before they go out onto the platform to lift, they'll go through and have somebody slap them. They'll sniff smelling salts. We had guys when I was in college who would take Icy Hot, if you're familiar with that. Same thing as like Theragesic or Bengay. It's all the same stuff. So they take Icy Hot and they'd put it under their eyes, which burns like crazy because they talked me into doing it one time. Burns like crazy, as you can imagine. And then they would sniff an ammonia cap and then they'd go lift, right? And so you can't get much more arousal than that. Like that is all kinds of pain stimuli. They're listening to heavy metal, right? And you're just getting mad and you've got pain and all of this stuff going on. And so to some extent that can help in a simple event in terms of complexity and skill level, like the squat or like the deadlift. Now I have seen, there is obviously a happy medium or a high point there. Sometimes people do get a little too amped and then they kind of forget their steps and their setup for their squat, or they forget the setup for the bench press. They go before the command or whatever, right? So there is still a cutoff point where you can have too high of a level of arousal, but in a sport like that, there does tend to be a pretty linear relationship. As opposed to, think about something like golf, right? And somebody who's making a putt for, a professional championship and thousands of dollars, right? And so there's a lot of pressure there. And so for somebody like that, that's a really more relatively complex task where they have to, read the green and they have to tap the ball just hard enough. I mean, the task itself, the swinging of the club is pretty straightforward. But the complexity is a little bit more because you have to react to the environment a little bit. And then you've got probably a higher skilled athlete. And so with that, that type of sports skill, putting for a championship, you're not going to want really high levels of arousal. Then my example here, because as I was making the slideshow, I was thinking about somebody like a goalie who is in a shootout, and so that goalie, same kind of thing. Like he doesn't want to be too amped up because he has to be able to watch the defender. He has to know this defender, or sorry, he has to be able to watch the offensive player. He's the defender. Has to be able to watch their movements and anticipate, and he probably also has to have that cognitive aspect of knowing that Brown here tends to do dribble and go forehand side. Like he probably has some pretty good ideas about their tendencies coming into that shootout. And so with that, if he was amped up in the same way that the powerlifters get amped up, where he's, rubbing icy hot under his eyes and sniffing ammonia caps as they come out of the timeout for the shootout, he's probably going to be a little bit too aroused, and so that may actually hamper his performance. And so drive theory, then, it's not exactly a linear relationship. There is a happy medium. And so that's what the inverted U theory says. So arousal facilitates performance up to a point, up to an optimal level, but beyond that point, further increases in arousal are associated with reduced performance. So for somebody like our hockey goalie, if he had done, the icy hot and ammonia caps bit, he might have gotten too much arousal, and so because of that, he wouldn't be focused on those cognitive things of, I know Brown tends to shoot forehand, and so he wouldn't be as prepared to anticipate those and to react to those things. But one of the problems with this theory, as you can see, is that the original version doesn't account for skill, ability, experience, or task complexity. In general, the more complex the task, the less arousal you want. Because again, if you get too much arousal, too amped up, then you can't do all the little things that you need to do. So for example, something like a baseball batter, similar to the hockey goalie, where he has to be able to look at the pitcher based on his body movements and what he knows about the pitcher, and based on how the ball appears coming out of his hand, he has to be able to anticipate this is a fastball and it's probably going to be inside. And so then he has to put the bat where he anticipates the ball is going to be, so he has to pull the bat a little bit. And so that's a pretty complex task, and so you don't want somebody like that to be overly aroused, overly excited going into that at bat, because then that's going to hamper performance. So the individual zones of optimal functioning, so again, we're improving on this. So inverted U, because it didn't account for all these things, now we're going to account for those things. So the individual zones of optimal functioning is that different people in different types of performances, so powerlifting versus golf putting, perform best with different levels of arousal. So one of the adaptations here is that it accounts for inter-individual differences, so differences between individuals. Some people really like to get really excited before they go out and swim 100 meters, and some people don't, right? And so you have to account for what it is that the individual feels makes them successful, as well as their skill level, the task complexity, and those kinds of things. One of the things about this one it also accounts for, which is good, is that both positive and negative emotions can enhance performance just as both can hamper it, right? So positive emotions, feeling good, maybe that can enhance your performance. You're nice and relaxed. You're going in, and so because you're relaxed, you don't have any muscle tension, so you're going to be able to perform a dive in a swimming and diving event really effectively without muscle tension, and it's no problem, right? So being relaxed for that individual, for that type of event, may be really advantageous, may foster enhanced performance. But at the same time, being really relaxed may be bad. Maybe you're too relaxed. Maybe you're flat, right? And so that's one of the things that athletes will talk about sometimes too, is that maybe the team was flat when they went out. They were unemotional. And so because of that, they weren't able to respond to something adverse that happened. The other team scored first, something like that, right? So even positive emotions can hamper performance if you're, too confident, too relaxed. That can potentially be bad. Negative emotions can hurt performance. If you're like, I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. But sometimes that can help drive performance. Not as often, but sometimes that can help drive performance, as we'll talk about here in a second. That idea of fear of failure, for some people, they want to avoid failure bad enough that it actually helps them perform a little bit better. So for some people, potentially that is something useful. So the catastrophe theory is this combination of arousal in the body and cognitive anxiety, and then the relationship between the two. So the idea here is that somatic, again, anything somatic is body, somatic arousal has a curvilinear relationship to performance. So as we are increasingly aroused, there is a happy medium, but that cognitive anxiety is going to show a steady negative relationship to performance. So as cognitive anxiety goes up, then that can lead to a big drop-off in performance. So physiological arousal in the presence of cognitive anxiety can cause a sudden drop rather than a gradual decline of performance. So that's kind of the opposition of the inverted U theory. So with the inverted U, you kind of have this gradual drop-off in performance. And what catastrophe theory says is that past a certain point of arousal, if there's also cognitive anxiety, they're worried about messing up, then that'll lead to just a huge drop in performance. They won't, be a tenth of a second worse. They'll be 3 seconds worse. So it'll be a massive decline in performance if those two meet. Reversal theory, the idea there is that it matters how we perceive arousal and how we perceive anxiety. So athletes can reverse their interpretation of arousal. So for some people, again, if they have that racing heart, sweaty palms, whatever, that can be sort of the start of a downhill slide for them. They can be like, oh man, I'm really nervous. I must feel unprepared. This isn't going to go well. Other people are like, oh, this is how it is pregame, and so now I'm ready to play. If I didn't feel like this, I would feel like I was probably flat. I wasn't aroused enough. They wouldn't use that word, but I wasn't excited enough, and so I didn't feel like I was in the game. Like I've heard stories about football players. I didn't play with anybody like this, but football players who would vomit before every game. Right? That was actually one of the characters. If you're into the Friday Night Lights book, like not the TV series, but the Friday Night Lights book, they talked about one of the players who was actually the only guy that ended up playing Division I college football would throw up before every game. That was his thing. And so it was because he had such a high state of arousal that was just, he got himself so worked up, he had to throw up. But then once he did that, he was fine, right? And so for him, if he didn't get to that point, if he didn't, get so aroused that he ended up throwing up before the game, I think it would probably throw off his performance, because in a weird way, he kind of interpreted that as part of the readiness. Being in such a high state of both psychological and physiological arousal that it actually caused him to vomit in that case. So if you perceive that as being positive, as being part of the experience, it can actually enhance your performance, even though other people would perceive that as being bad, right? Like if somebody told me they threw up before every performance, I'd be like, you should probably get that under control. Like that seems like too much. But if their perception of that is that's what helps them, then potentially, in fact, that is what helps them. So in terms of definitions, so motivation is the intensity and direction of effort. So if you are motivated to earn money, that's the direction of your effort, is earning money. And then let's say you're highly motivated to earn money. So the highly motivated describes the intensity of the effort, right? You're probably familiar with the concept of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is internally derived motivation. So it's this desire to be competent. I want to be good at something, and I want to have control over my abilities. That's self-determining. So they may set goals to develop competence in sports skills. So maybe it is that they want to make varsity as a sophomore in whatever their sport is. So that's their goal, and then that's their intrinsic motivation is they feel like they can demonstrate that they're really good at their sport. Let's say it's a basketball player. She's really good at her sport if she's able to make varsity as a sophomore, and so her that displays her competence, and so that makes her feel good that she's accomplished this goal that she set for herself. That's intrinsic motivation. So that's going to exist regardless of material reward, so regardless of that quest for the letter jacket or regardless of the punishment. So, in that case, to make varsity basketball as a sophomore, it's not necessarily a punishment in this example, but there's a trade-off of, you got to spend a certain amount of time taking shots and practicing and lifting weights and running and all that. And so you're going to make other sacrifices as a result of that. Social life is going to take a little bit of a hit. Maybe your ability to, watch Netflix and do those other things takes a bit of a hit, or play video games takes a bit of a hit as the trade-off. So with intrinsic motivation, the athletes enjoy the activity in and of itself. This is the thing as coaches, we always want the athletes to be intrinsically motivated. Of course, not everyone is, but we want the athletes, we want the athletes who love the game. And so you've heard, or I've heard, even professional teams, like when they're talking to people that they're considering drafting, one of the questions they'll ask them is, and try to gauge, is how much they love the game, because they're looking at intrinsic motivation. If they just have that drive, they just want to be successful because that's how they are, then they're going to be the ones who are going to work harder in practice. They're going to be the ones who show up on time, who do the extra film work, those kinds of things that it takes that ultimately make the team successful. And so what we want to develop then, or help develop or find, if we're recruiting, is athletes who are intrinsically motivated, who just have that love of the game, and so they want to show their competence, and they're going to just do it no matter what, right? Oh, I didn't know the GIF would work. Good. All right, good. Glad to see the thing worked. For extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is you are motivated by something outside of you. So the motivation is derived from an external source. So either you're seeking rewards, maybe you want to make a bunch of money. You want to be a professional athlete so you can make money, right? That's extrinsic motivation. Maybe you want to be a varsity athlete so you can get a letter jacket. That's extrinsic motivation. Or maybe you want to avoid punishment. So that's my example I got going on here. My hockey example is here. So seeking rewards. Former teammates of my sons in hockey, their parents would pay the kids for goals, which I get the motivation there. Then the kid's going to go try to take a shot because he wants $5 or whatever he gets for the goals. But of course, from a coaching standpoint, the problem with that is now that kid is going to take every shot he possibly can, even if it's not a great angle, when it would be better off for the team if he would pass to the other forward and let that guy shoot because that guy has a better angle on the goal. And so then that sort of extrinsic motivation can be problematic. The other thing, bag skates, they're punishment skates. You're probably familiar with it in whatever your sport is. So that's what's happening here with Kurt Russell. I don't know if you've seen the movie Miracle about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. And so there's this famous scene in that movie where he just, he asks them throughout the movie, asks all the athletes on Team USA who they play for, and they all say what colleges they go to. So Boston University, Minnesota, etc., right? And what he's going for, what he's trying to get them to realize is that they're representing their country. They play for Team USA. And so they go out this one game and they play like crap. And after the game, he has them do, they have various names. Michigan Miles is one that I'm familiar with. Basically, you start on the goal line, and you skate to the blue line and back, red line and back, goal line and back, or other blue line and back, and then the other goal line and back, right? And so they're similar to horses in basketball, or same concept as, or a similar concept as gassers or ladders in football, right? So everybody has their similar punishments. And so Kurt Russell is just like again. And so if you know that kind of a punishment is coming, then maybe you seek to enhance your performance to avoid a punishment like that, right? So maybe you're working a little bit harder in the game not necessarily because you're seeking any reward, but basically because you're trying to avoid punishment. So you see the same kind of thing. Sometimes coaches will say, okay, for football receivers, if you drop the ball, it's going to cost you 10 push-ups. And so the idea is to get their attention, that they're going to seek to avoid the punishment. But the trade-off there is oftentimes now they're so focused on don't drop it, don't drop it, don't drop it, that they're probably going to drop it, right? So that's kind of the downside there. So achievement motivation is a person's efforts to master a task, achieve excellence, overcome obstacles, and engage in competition or social comparison. So it is essentially someone's appetite for competition. Some people just like to compete all the time, whether it is in sports, whether it's in the classroom, gambling, etc. There are some people that just like to compete no matter what the venue is. So that's achievement motivation. There's a couple different subcategories of that. The first is motivation to achieve success. So they want to be good at everything, right? You want to win, you want to show that you're the best tennis player, that you have the best forehand, the fastest serve, all those kinds of things. That's motivation to achieve success. Motivation to avoid failure is trying to avoid the perception of shame that's going to come with failure. So if you messed up, people aren't heaping praise on you and hugging you after the game, whatever. They're patting you on the back, being like, it's okay. Everybody knows it would have been nice to win, but it's okay. You're still fine. You're still a good player, right? So you're trying to avoid that shame that's associated with losing, with failure at whatever the event is. So motivation to avoid failure tends to favor blowouts one way or the other. So either they want to blow the other team out, or they want to get blown out so that there was no chance that they could have won, right? So close games for people who are failure avoidant tend to be the most anxiety inducing. So your higher level athletes, to no one's real surprise here, tend to be motivated to achieve success rather than avoid failure, because again, from a mental standpoint, you're already sort of focused on failure, and I'm not going to do that thing. In terms of motivation to achieve success, as I was going through this section of the book, I was reminded a few years ago, I was watching the College Baseball World Series, and Cal State Fullerton was in it that year. And so in their dugout, they had a sports psychologist that worked with the team. And so he had taken athletic tape, and he'd written on the tape, think of how good it's going to feel. And so he was trying to get them to avoid that motivation to avoid failure. So rather than going out there and being like, all right, I got to get a hit, otherwise it's going to be embarrassing, otherwise all these negative things are going to happen. He was trying to recast that arousal, recast that anxiety as positive. Think about how good it's going to feel when you get that hit, when we win this game, when you're holding up the championship trophy, those kinds of things. And so they always talked about how good it's going to feel. Again, trying to cast that positive, that achievement motivation there. Motivational aspects of skill and learning. So the idea here is that we're going to involve our athletes related to the practice structure. So the more that the athletes feel like they have say in the practice structure, the more likely they are to give good effort. So it's not just you doing something to them, but through a dialogue with them, maybe we need to work on our conditioning. So that's why we're going to skate these Michigan miles. That's why we're going to run these gassers after practice, or these horses after practice, that kind of thing. And so the idea there is that if they agree, like, yeah, you're right, that other team did have better conditioning than us, they're faster than us, so we should work on those things, they're going to run harder during those miserable drills at the end of practice than they would if it was just like, coach says we have to run 10 horses, right? And so they're just going to kind of slog through it. So if they feel like they're involved in the decisions, if they feel like their input is valued, they tend to give more buy-in and tend to give better effort. Now that said, that's an ideal world. If you're working with 10-year-olds, or even high school kids, a lot of the time, you probably won't be able to do this much. But it's worth a shot. So positive and negative reinforcement. There's a question about this in the test bank. So positive reinforcement increases the likelihood of the behavior recurring. So my first thought there is potty training a dog. That you go out there and take a puppy and put them in the grass, and if they go to the bathroom, then you're such a good boy and here's a treat, right? And so that's that positive reinforcement. So the dog's gonna be like, oh, all I gotta do is go pee in this grass, I can handle that. And so then that increases the likelihood that that behavior is going to recur. They're not going to go to the bathroom in the house because there's no reward for that. But if they go outside, now there's a reward. So that's positive reinforcement. Not to be too patronizing, but we all like to be praised, right? Just like the puppy does. We all like to be told that we did a good job and that we worked hard and that our project was good and all those sort of things. And so then, if you go and write a paper and your instructor tells you it's the best paper they've ever seen, great work, really appreciate your effort, you're more likely to do something like that in terms of how much effort you expend the next time a similar project rolls around. So that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is punishment. That can be positive punishment, which is sort of weird sounding. Positive punishment means that you're adding it. So the bag skates, the again skates, that's actually positive punishment. It is because you didn't do this thing, now we have to skate all these Michigan miles. As opposed to negative punishment is removing something that they like. So negative punishment would be we don't get to go out for team dinner anymore. Instead, you're all going to have peanut butter and jelly in your rooms or something like that. So you're taking away the team dinner that they enjoy. You're taking away TV time, video game time, whatever it is, something that they enjoy. Taking away a day off, something like that. And that's kind of both. But so the thing to know there, positive punishment is you're adding punishment, and then negative punishment is you're taking something away from them that they like. So attention, early on in the slideshow, we talked about the idea of making sure you're focused on task-relevant things, not task-irrelevant things. So attention then is processing of both environmental and internal cues that come to your awareness. So, the temperature around you, the wind, the sounds around you, the sights around you, that's all the environmental stuff. Internal cues would be like my stomach is gurgling, my heart is racing, etc. Right? Those are all internal cues. So where you focus your attention can either help or hurt your performance. So selective attention then is trying to focus that attention, trying to avoid all those task irrelevant cues. If you're this kicker, that's Justin Tucker getting ready to take this kick. So this kick is for the winning, potentially the winning field goal in the last game of the Texas A&M rivalry from 2010. Right, and so if he makes this kick, it's a big deal. Texas wins the last game in a more than 100-year rivalry. If he misses this kick, Texas loses the game. Right, that's a lot of pressure. And so they're at the visiting stadium, really loud crowd. The place is rocking. Everybody's screaming at him. Everybody is hoping he misses. Right, and so if you're taking that kick, then and as an aside, Justin Tucker is a pretty good kicker for the Ravens now in the NFL. If you're taking that kick, then you can't focus on all the people in the stands yelling at you. It doesn't matter that the temperature is 68 degrees. The wind matters a little bit, but not a ton, right? So he probably took stock of that as he was coming onto the field, but then that's the end of that. So the idea here is that you suppress all those task-irrelevant things. All he needs to do is to look at the holder, see the ball, kick the ball, right? And so one of the things that kickers do, because obviously they're in a lot of high pressure situations like this, is they have a dedicated routine of they take 3 steps back, 2 steps to the side, good to go. And so by doing that, by having that routine, that improves the automaticity. So if they do that every single time they kick, every time they've been on the practice field, and by this point this game is in November, if he's been doing that every game since he was in high school, and then every game in college, and he's been doing this for 4 straight months. Every time he kicks, 3 steps back, 2 steps to the side. This kick is just like every other. It takes some of the variables out. It just focuses on repeating what you always do, right? That's that concept of automaticity. And so, again, avoiding all those task irrelevant things. It doesn't matter what the crowd's doing. Doesn't really matter what the opposition is doing. They're going to jump up and try to block it. But you just know always you have to get the ball to a certain height, right? And then ultimately he was successful. Texas wins. Woo! And so I guess the final score then 27-25, and then Texas won the last game in the series. So, and you see that too. So I talked early on about, one of my very few experiences, like being in the zone and from a powerlifting standpoint. And one of the things that I know we would do on our team is like people can expend too much energy setting up for the squat. So you take the bar out of the rack. It's probably a pretty heavy weight for you. And so you take the bar out of the rack, you take 2 steps or whatever your number is. You always do left foot, right foot, and then you're set. Now you wait for the signal, now you squat. And if you always do that, then that helps, that selective attention. It helps you not focus on the audience. It helps you not focus on how heavy the weight is, those kinds of things. And so not necessarily related to attention, but related to like squatting like that in competition. One of the things that we would do is to do what's called walkouts, where you put a heavier weight than you would ever lift in competition on your shoulder. So let's say you're going to squat 500. Maybe you would take 550 out of the rack. Maybe you take 575 out of the rack, just so you get used to feeling that heavy weight, right? And we see the same kind of thing with basketball, where sometimes the coach will set it up where one person's shooting free throws, and if they miss, everybody has to run. So they're trying to create that pressure environment. But if the person taking the free throws has that routine, kind of like Giannis, and like most basketball players do, then hopefully that automaticity will kick in, and it'll just be, this is what I do to make shots, this is what makes me successful, and I'm just going to do that. And all those extraneous variables about how mad my teammates are going to be if I miss, none of that stuff matters. In terms of attentional styles, so you can see the different quadrants here of attentional styles. So the axes, the x-axis goes from focused on external things, so things outside of me, to internal things inside of me. Really broad focus, all kinds of different things, to a relatively narrow focus. So I'm just looking at a couple of different things. And so with those quadrants, so quadrant 1 is broad external. So that's over here, so your top left. So in quadrant 1, the athlete is going to assess the situation by looking at the environment and then various elements within it. Quadrant 2, the athlete, so now we're top right. The athlete is going to process information and develop a strategy. Now we're moving internal and narrow, which is quadrant 3, so bottom right. Athlete's going to mentally rehearse the upcoming action. And then quadrant 4, bottom left, the athlete specifically focuses on 1 or 2 external cues to generate action. And so why any of that matters is it affects how you coach. An athlete who gets overloaded with external stimuli can be coached to focus on one important cue, like the opponent's footwork, versus athletes who get lost in their own heads can be asked to think out loud, so they verbalize what's going on in their head, and then that'll change their focus a little bit. So there's a variety of different relaxation techniques. If I'm honest, I'm not particularly good at any of them, but they're designed to reduce that physiological arousal, and by reducing the physiological arousal to help you focus on task-relevant things. So kind of the most basic one is this diaphragmatic breathing, also known as belly breathing. And so it's this sequence of big, deep breaths in. And so when you're taking your big, deep breaths in, it's called belly breathing because you're supposed to let your diaphragm relax. You're supposed to let your abdominal musculature relax, and so that your belly can become distended. And then when you exhale, ideally, the exhalation is going to proceed from the bottom up, and then you're going to push the air out. So that if you're focusing on your breathing, you're not focused on worrying. You're not focused on failure, those kinds of things. And so that's kind of the idea here. It helps kind of recenter your focus. So that's diaphragmatic breathing. Progressive muscle relaxation, or PMR, is this basically if you're fairly anxious about something, your muscles are going to be fairly tight. There's going to be some actual muscular tension. And so what you do is you progressively contract and relax muscles. Right, and so it's that alternating periods of contraction and relaxation. So, you contract your forearm muscles and then let them go. And then contract your biceps or your elbow flexors and then let them go. Contract your extensors and let them go. And so by doing that, you sort of exert that voluntary control. So again, that tension is coming from the autonomic nervous system. And so you're trying to override that with conscious thought. And so if we can get control of which muscles are contracted and which muscles are relaxed, potentially that's going to help facilitate more efficient movement. So if you're tight throughout your lower body, you're going to have your quads, for example, fighting against your hamstrings. And so that just takes up extra energy, so that's not very efficient. So if we can get the hamstrings to relax, then that takes less effort from the quads, less ATP, and so that makes the movement more efficient. Autogenic training is sometimes recommended for individuals for whom really strong muscle contractions are not advised, so the elderly usually. And so what they focus on then is feeling that tension or feeling the warmth of a limb, even if it's not especially warm, but feeling warmth in that limb. And so it just makes you aware of what's going on in that limb. And so hopefully then that'll help you relax that musculature that is otherwise tight. Desensitization is something that's done if the athlete had some kind of a bad experience. So in terms of previously neutral stimuli, so something like the balance beam for a gymnast, maybe they had a bad fall. And so now every time they're going to do a balance beam thing, it's sort of anxiety provoking for them. And so how do we get them to deal with that? Well, none of us are probably particularly good at it, but a trained psychologist would do something like this, where you have them develop pretty good skills in the diaphragmatic breathing, and then in the progressive muscle relaxation, and then you have them go through this mental exercise where they're going to construct what happened. Okay, so they think through that time they fell off the balance beam and hurt themselves. And so obviously then that's going to provoke a psychological response and a physiological response. So they're going to develop muscle tension, they're going to grit their teeth, they're going to do all those kinds of things. And so what you do then is to have them engage in that progressive muscle relaxation while they're thinking through that stuff. So as they're mentally reconstructing what went wrong, they'll do those progressive muscle relaxation techniques to try to contract and relax those muscles to tamp that anxiety down. And then once they get really good at it, once they've gone through that a few times, now we can try to have them hold that mental image of them falling off the beam, what that felt like, and then engaging in that progressive muscle relaxation, so that eventually that neutral stimuli, hopefully, in an ideal world, becomes neutral again. So they're not afraid of the balance beam anymore. They can get out there and they can try again. Imagery is, imagining a performance. So that is going through and, if you're we'll stick with a gymnast, for example, you on the bus ride over or the night before, you are mentally going through your routine. All right, I'm going to do, and I don't know anything about gymnastics, I'm going to do a cartwheel, and I'm going to do a flip, and whatever it is that routine entails. And going through it, you're mentally rehearsing all the things that happen. And if you're really doing imagery as you're supposed to, you're also going to try to envision all those task irrelevant things, actually. So you're going to try to think about what the facility looks like. You're going to think about where the beam sits in the facility, where the crowd is, what kind of things you may smell. Maybe you smell popcorn, what kind of things you're going to hear, all those kinds of things, so that when you get to the actual event, it is like you've almost been there before. That's kind of the idea behind imagery. One of the things, so there's Michael Phelps in the lower right. He had a coach who worked with him for a long time on some of the imagery stuff about kind of, going through a race in his mind just over and over and over again. Here's how many strokes you're going to take. Here's how they're going to feel. Here's how your hand's going to hit the water. All those kinds of things, so that he'd swam that race in his head dozens, maybe 100 or more times before he actually got in the water to swim that race, at the World Championships or at the Olympics. And so there's a really high stakes event. I don't remember what the event was. I think it was the World Championships, but it might have been the Olympics, where Phelps, shortly after he got into the pool, his goggles fell off. And so, you can imagine what a problem that is, because now he can't see. And so the coach apparently realized this, and the coach, the way he talked about those imagery exercises was as playing the tape. You're going through a video in your mind of what this race is going to look like. And so the coach starts shouting at him to play the tape. And so he was able to swim the race with like one goggle half off and still win the race, in part because he was that good. But part of it's that imagery thing of just he'd done that race and he'd thought about it, kind of pictured in his mind so many times that he was still able to perform even with impaired vision in that case. So again, it allows the athlete to experience that competition repeatedly, so that when they get there, it feels familiar. Another definition one, so self-efficacy. So self-confidence is the belief that somebody can successfully perform a particular behavior. You can make a free throw. Self-efficacy is situationally specific, a situationally specific form of self-confidence. You believe you can do this particular task, right? So if they are highly self-efficacious, they don't doubt their ability to succeed at a given task, even if failure is experienced, which brought to mind then the famous Michael Jordan quote that I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games, 26 times, missed the game-winning shot, failed over and over and over again, and that's why I succeed, right? And so that somebody who is like him, who is highly self-efficacious, he always believes he's going to hit that shot, and oftentimes he did. And so that's that concept of self-efficacy, of just like doubt doesn't creep into your mind. Afterwards, yeah, I missed. But as you're taking the shot, it is that genuine belief, like that's going to happen. I'm going to lift this weight. I'm going to make this shot. I'm going to win this race, etc. So sources of self-efficacy, performance accomplishments. So that quote is focuses on the negative, but Michael Jordan obviously hit a lot of game-winning shots, and he made a lot of shots. So he focuses on the negative there in laying that argument out. But part of his self-efficacy was based on his performance, that more often than not, he did make those shots. Vicarious experiences, so you feel like you can do it because you've seen other people be successful at it. Verbal persuasion, somebody tells you you're going to be successful at it. So verbal persuasion comes in with like pre-game speeches from coaches. So hopefully you've seen the Miracle movie. There's a really famous speech in that one, the one where the coach is doing the again thing, where he talks about the Americans are going up against the Soviet hockey team that's won the last several gold medals in the Olympics, and they are extraordinarily overmatched. Nobody thinks they're going to win, and so one of the things the coach tells them before the game is he says, 9 times out of 10 the Soviets are going to win this game, but not tonight. And so he goes through this whole thing about tonight is our night, we skate with them, whatever, right? And so at the end, everybody's like, yeah, we're going to go win. And then they do. And so that's the verbal persuasion, is that the coach genuinely believes, or, is conveying a genuine belief that they're going to win that game. And so because of that, they've been persuaded, like, yeah, you know what, we can win. Tonight is our night, that kind of thing. Imaginal experience, again, the use of imagery. So I've been here before. I've seen how this is going to go. It ends with me making the shot. Physiological states. So, if you're excited, and you feel like you felt the last time you were successful, that would facilitate those feelings of self-efficacy, and then your emotional states. So athletes who believe in themselves, as no one is surprised about this, tend to work harder and are more determined to achieve the desired outcome. Self-talk is just what it sounds like. So that is, talking to yourself, come on, you can do this. Sometimes we all get that negative voice in our head, like, you don't belong here, you're not good enough, all that kind of stuff. So that's negative self-talk. And then instructional self-talk is kind of talking yourself through the technique. Like, okay, make sure you focus on I'm trying to think of basic instructional stuff that's not lifting related. Focus on the pitcher's position, look for their shoulder to open up, whatever it is. I've been away from baseball coaching for a long time. But something like that, right? So that's instructional self-talk, kind of talking yourself through how to successfully perform this activity. If the instructional self-talk comes during something that should be automatic, that can hamper performance, because now you're focusing on, or you're not just doing the activity, that's the automaticity. And so with respect to self-talk, the little famous saying down here in the lower right, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Goal setting, you're all familiar with this. So I won't belabor this too much. So there's an important distinction here between process and outcome goals. So process goals are those things that we have control over. So if we are, trying to make the varsity team, soccer team, for example, then, the athlete can't really control whether or not they make the varsity team, because maybe somebody they're competing against has just an out of their mind performance that day, just completely out of character, and they just really show up at tryouts, and maybe our athlete, just even though they gave their best effort, it just wasn't quite there. So they don't really have control over that outcome, but they have control over the process. And the process is, well, in order to be a varsity player, I have to be able to, have the aerobic capacity to run 6 miles at a given pace. I have to be able to have a certain amount of strength to be able to control my body weight. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to work on my aerobic capacity. I'm going to work on being able to maintain 7.5-minute miles for 6 miles or something like that. I'm going to work on being able to squat 1.5 times body weight, those kind of things. The athlete can control that, whether or not they hit those goals. So those are process goals. As opposed to outcome goals, if the goal is to win, sometimes you're going to play a team that is just better than you. That's just the way things go. And so no matter what you could have done, you played the best you could have played, you still lose because they're more skilled, they're more athletic, they're faster, all those kinds of things. So that's part of the game. Sometimes that happens. And so you don't really have any control over winning. So what you do then is you focus on the things that you can control. So for example, because this semester I'm teaching in the SAC, where there's the football goal board. And so one of the things that they have for each game is a variety of different things, so no turnovers. What are some of their other ones? Let's say related to punting a certain number of yards, those kind of things. So there are those little process things that they have control over where if they don't turn the ball over, they're more likely to win. And so if they do all of these things that they have control over, that may not result in a win, but it increases the likelihood of them winning, right? And so that's focusing then on process goals. And I really like this. I've always been a fan of this with respect to coaching and with respect to motivation. John Wooden talked a lot about effort and your best effort. And so the idea was that if you did the best you could have possibly done, you prepared as well as you could have, you worked as hard as you could have in every practice, you watched film every time you could have, all of those things that go into an outstanding performance. And if you gave your best effort in the game, then that's all you could have done. That was your best, right? And so if you lost, but you couldn't have done better. Now, it's pretty rare that we've done everything we could have possibly done. Maybe you could have spent more time in film. Maybe you could have ran a little bit harder on some of the shifts that you were out there on the floor. Those kinds of things. It's pretty rare that we've actually done our actual best. But if you have and you still lost, there wasn't another thing you could have done. So it's kind of that idea of controlling what you can control as well. Short-term goals. So obviously short-term goals are geared toward meeting long-term goals. So maybe the athlete's long-term goal is to be a collegiate athlete, if you're working with a high school kid. Maybe their goal is to, play lacrosse at Duke or something, or play lacrosse at, I'm trying to think of who's good these days, Maryland. Something like that, a top program, right? So that's the long-term goal. Then how do we do that in terms of the short-term goals tie into the long-term goal? Well, in order to be an elite level lacrosse player, you got to be able to shoot with both hands. You got to be able to shoot with both hands from distance. You got to be able to stick handle pretty well, maybe do some stuff behind your head, those kinds of things. And so we work on all those little short-term goals, all the components you need to reach the long-term goal. So it's very much related to some of those process things. Controlling those aspects of performance that you can control to try to get you to that long-term goal. Learning versus performance. So learning is that they can do the skill successfully. So, this is a little girl doing a snatch, right? So, she's done it in the gym. That's her doing it right there. Obviously, she's learned how to perform a snatch. But performance is being able to do it in the current environment. So maybe she then goes to a meet and then she can't lift the bar. Like she just, her pull is out of order and she just doesn't do it very well. So she didn't perform, but it's not a learning issue. She knows how to do it. She just wasn't able to do it in that current environment. So there's a lack of performance there. Whole versus part practice is you do the skill as a whole versus you break it down into its various components. There's all the different versions of whole versus part practice. So segmentation versus fractionalization. I won't read those to you as I have some of these other slides, but just be aware there's some questions about the different aspects of whole versus part practice. More complex skills, you're going to do some of the part stuff, and then so like for example with the snatch from the last slide, that's a pretty complex movement. And so if we're teaching that skill, we usually break it down into multiple components. So maybe you have them do a pull from their, like a high pull from their hips, and then maybe you have them flip the bar overhead, and then maybe you have them do an overhead half squat, and then maybe an overhead full squat. And so you work through those different components, and then we eventually tie it all together. So that's part practice, and then eventually we'll work our way up to whole practice for something that's really complex. As opposed to something like a deadlift that's pretty straightforward, you typically do that as whole practice. And then same kind of thing, I won't read this one to you either, but random versus variable practice, and then observational learning, watching somebody perform it, and then also learning from their own performances. And then instructions, and feedback. So yeah, all the relevant information on these last couple slides is on the slide. So if there's a question in the test bank about any of these things, you can look it up pretty easily. And this is all pretty intuitive stuff. Not a lot I can add to these slides. And that is it. So we'll see you next time for chapter, let's see, what is this one? This one's 8. We've already been through so many chapters, I forgot where we are. So next time we move on to 9, which is nutrition. 9 and 10 are nutrition, and then 11 is ergogenic aids. So we'll see you for the nutrition section next time.